We are back with Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. We are in chapter 5, Have You No Shame? So to kick off the chapter, our question today is, when you were growing up, was there a specific rule or expectation your parents gave you that wasn't about your own safety, but about how you represented the family in public? So think about that for a moment and then share it with your neighbors. I think this is a fun question to introduce the chapter because we all have experiences like this where you've got to uphold the family name. Don't bring shame. Like, this might be one experience we have in our culture that will help us understand the concept of this honor shame culture that we're going to read about. So confession, I do a lot of research for this class, but for this particular chapter, I really had to do some research because I've not personally been a missionary. I've not experienced a culture that is an honor shame culture. And so I went to Elaine. So I went to Elaine Denman, and he doesn't know it, but I got help from her brother, Everett, from our trip 3 years ago in Turkey. He gave a lesson on this very thing. And so I was going to show it a little bit later, but Everett, if you're watching, I have your notes. And he was worried that no one reads his guidebooks, but we're still using them. Kathy Middleton is shaking her head. So we still use them. Let's see what honor shame looks like. And I don't know about you. The closest thing I can think of to understanding an honor shame culture is the Disney movie Mulan. Growing up, I watched this movie, and that was my only experience of what an honor shame culture was. In her Eastern culture, it's about honoring her family. The way that women and girls honor their family is to be married and have children. Mulan has a different view of how to bring her family honor. Mulan didn't obey the matchmaker. She didn't get a husband. And so she's seen as bringing shame on her family. They end up going to war and they try and conscript her father. She steals his conscription card. She has to dress as a man to fight. And she goes to fight on his behalf. And at the end, of course, they win. She comes home and they find out that the hero of the battle was Mulan. She becomes the hero who earns praise and transforms the concept of shame into a story of ultimate loyalty and honor. Growing up, I watched this movie, and that was my only experience of what an honor shame culture was. I want to show you a map that I thought was very interesting. There is a man named Jason Georges, and he has a website called honorshame.com, and he teaches missionaries how to operate within honor shame cultures. So a very helpful tool. And on his website, he has this global map of cultures. And so this is how different cultures around the world perceive life and morality. And so in our Western culture, you notice there's a lot of blue. We are what's called a guilt culture. So our individualist society, we focus more on like laws. And in other cultures, like all of the pinkish and red ones here on the map, these are what's called the honor shame cultures. There is a third category that's called a fear power culture. There aren't as many of those, more like tribal areas. So we're going to focus more on the shame and honor cultures. As we tackle this chapter and as we learn to read our Bibles, not just from our own perspective, but from the perspective of honor shame cultures, I think it's really important to keep this in mind. Not that we're all going to go out and be missionaries, but there are different ways that people read the Bible, different lenses that they read it through, or another word would be a worldview, a different worldview that they read the Bible through. Now, it's still the same biblical story, right? It's still God's story of salvation. But we're going to see in this chapter that through an honor shame lens, the Bible story becomes much richer. Now, on page 114 in our book, the authors, they open the chapter with a story from their mission work, but then they go into definitions of a Western view of right and wrong. So on page 114, they're setting this up to help us understand our own worldview that, yes, we're individualists. We learned that in the last chapter. But more than that, our view of right and wrong is that we will be internally motivated to make good choices, right? And so we see that through Plato. In his Republic, he had an allegory called of the Ring of Gyges. So that's on the bottom of 114. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular story, but it's basically where Lord of the Rings got their inspiration. There's a lot of other stories that have an ill-gotten magical ring, and what it does is it makes the wearer invisible. In Plato's Republic, what he's talking about is, how do people make good choices? People might be inclined to make poor choices if they know they're invisible, there's no consequences. And on page 115, Plato wrote, "No man would keep his hands off of what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked out of the market. The suggestion is that ordinary humans do right only if others are watching." So this is one of the great philosophy debates, and the authors are using this to help set up our individualist point of view, that we view moral choices as choices of our conscience, right? And then that goes into Edgar Allan Poe on the bottom of 115. They use this piece of American literature, The Telltale Heart. The authors are using the Ring of Gyges and the Telltale Heart to show how in our culture we depend on our conscience. Let's look at page 114. It's the end of that first paragraph under defining a Western view of right and wrong. At that last sentence of that first paragraph, they say our point is that our decisions to act rightly are not necessarily made with other people in mind, to please others, for example, but on the basis of an objective and largely individual sense of right and wrong. Let's get into, page 116, where they define honor and shame. And so they say, right under that paragraph on 116, things work differently in shame cultures. In shame cultures, people are more likely to choose right behavior on the basis of what society expects from them. It's not a matter of guilt, nor an inner voice of direction, but outer pressures and opinions that direct a person to behave a certain way. Rules and laws are less a deterrent for bad behavior than the risk of bringing shame on oneself or one's family. Elaine talked to me a lot about what it means to keep face or to save face. And so she gave me quite a few examples of what she has seen as a missionary kid and a missionary herself over in the Middle East. And so she talked about how they will do anything to save face. It's all about honor and bringing honor on your family's name. And so she said, there are times where they will never admit a mistake because that would bring shame. Individuals will speak and act and believe in ways that bring honor to their communities and avoid shame. And truth is important, but should be swept under the rug if embracing or even entertaining it would bring shame. Westerners privilege being right over being in relationship, whereas those in the ancient world would always privilege the relationship over anything else. So that's why in their culture, honor is higher than truth, because the relationship is what counts. They don't ever want to shame you. They want to bring honor to you. And so it's a very different way of thinking, isn't it? Whereas we always want to be right and be correct and follow the law, sometimes at the expense of a relationship. And in that culture, they value the relationship more than the honesty. So Elaine told me that, they'll never tell you no. Never, ever. If you ask them to go somewhere or do something, they might say, Lord willing, or they'll give you a maybe, but they'll never give you a no, because that might bring shame. They don't want to tell you no. So they'll find ways to tell you no. Well, and if they say yes, she also said, if they say yes, that's not a full yes. It's really a maybe. Yeah, because they don't want to bring shame to you. They summarize it on 118. In an innocent guilt culture, which includes most Western societies, the laws of society, the rules of the church, local mores, and the code of the home are all internalized in the person. So all of that is what we call in our conscience. The goal is that when a person breaks one of these, his or her conscience will be pricked. Okay? The battle is fought on the inside for us. In an honor-shame society such as that of the Bible and much of the non-Western world today, the driving force is to not bring shame upon yourself, your family, your church, your village, your tribe, or even your faith. We'll come back to that thought toward the end. The determining force is the expectations of your significant others, primarily your family. Their expectations don't override morals or right wrong. They actually are the ethical standards. In these cultures, you're shamed when you disappoint those whose expectations matter. Okay, so you see the difference in thought. Westerners internalize it, whereas non-Westerners depend on their family, their tribe, to set what's right and wrong. On page 120, they make an interesting comment. Paul shows no sign of a troubled conscience before or after his conversion. Yet we don't know how to have a conversion without inner guilt. Doesn't Jesus promise a paraclete, an advocate that will convict the world? Absolutely, John 16. But what goes without being said for us is that conviction must be internal. In fact, we might mistakenly assume that this is the only way the Spirit might work, is to be convicted internally. Actually, the Spirit uses both inner conviction, a sense of guilt, and external conviction, a sense of shame. While the ancient world and most of the non-Western world contain honor-shame cultures, God can work effectively in both. Let's look at some examples of this. So they go through and give a couple examples from the Old Testament and then some from the New. And let's start with the Old on page 120. So this is honor and shame in the Old Testament, and they introduce it with David and Bathsheba. Wasn't this interesting? I would love for you to talk with your neighbors about what surprised you most about David and Bathsheba's story, read from the honor-shame lens point of view. So go ahead and talk to your neighbor. What was most interesting to you? And it took Nathan, I like how they say on the bottom of 120, the prophet Nathan was the tool of the Spirit to convict David of his sin with Bathsheba. So again, there's that external conviction of sin. And on page 127, towards the bottom, if we assume David thought like a Westerner with an introspective conscience, we're likely to miss the point altogether. So does God work through shame or guilt-based methods? We think the answer is both.
Would be extremely valuable when you're working with as a missionary.
Right. Yes, because they understand it a little differently. Elaine told me that she and other missionaries learned that preaching love to Middle Easterners doesn't have the same effect as preaching honor. Like they don't get it the same way. Let's move on to our New Testament example. On page 129, public questions were never for information. Did that surprise you? Yes. So it says public questions were contests. The winner was determined by the audience who represented the community. If you silenced your opponent, you gained honor and they lost some. One of the famous examples is, should they pay taxes to Caesar? Matthew 22. The questions are posed in the most important public place in all of Israel. They're in the temple court. There couldn't be any higher stakes in the honor game here. And the second point Matthew makes is at the end of the conflict, no one could say a word in reply. And from that day on, no one dared ask him more questions. Jesus won. So his answers brought him honor and shame on the questioners, right? We can think of lots of examples where Jesus was publicly questioned, like the Good Samaritan, right? What's the greatest command? I love this scene from The Chosen. There were some very good depictions in The Chosen of these public questions. And you can see the crowd behind, and, you know, they're clapping or cheering for who they like and who has the better answer. Yeah, so the middle toward the bottom of 130, they needed to publicly disgrace Jesus in order to get their honor back. They needed him executed as a criminal. because that would bring shame. Remember, anyone who dies on a tree and the curse? Yeah. So this is, in their mind, the ultimate shaming. If we think about Jesus's death as the ultimate shaming, I want to reframe that here. There's two words I want you to know. So kavod is our Hebrew word. We're going to use that for glory. And then the other word is in Greek. It's doxa. I'm telling you these words because one of the tips the authors give at the end of the chapter is go back through some of these verses and swap out honor for the word glory, and you'll see this honor shame culture pop out. Elaine summarized the entire gospel with the honor shame lens for me, and I want to share that with you. The Bible story is all about restored status, restored honor. So you think about Garden of Eden, right? When Adam and Eve sinned, they were sent away from the garden. Right? They brought shame on God by disobeying. We get to Moses. You remember how Moses goes up on Mount Sinai? He actually goes up there like 6 times. But he asks God, show me your face. We think this face right here, the literal face. That's not really what that means in honor shame language. So he wants to see the face, which is the ultimate honor of the one he is representing. So Moses is really saying, show me the full weight of your reputation so that I can represent you to a people who just shame themselves with a golden calf. We get to the crucifixion, which we just read was supposed to be the ultimate shaming. But Ray Vanderlaan noticed that the entire sequence of events of Jesus's death that we read about in the book of Mark, it actually follows exactly with a Roman triumph. What's happening here is he's connecting Jesus's crucifixion and saying it's really his coronation. So Jesus was not shamed, but received the ultimate honor. So I'll put that video for you to watch. What does that mean for us as Christians? So we are image bearers. It's our job to reflect the doxa, the glory of God. And, what does it mean that Christ is in you with glory? So that's from Colossians 1:27. When we accept Christ and receive salvation, we're no longer, like, our faces aren't shiny, right? So how do we reflect the glory of God? How do we reflect this honor? So it's by living a life that is the fruits of the Spirit, right? It's those character traits from Exodus 34. And, we don't just see the glory of God, we reflect it to the people around us. So, we embody God's character with mercy and justice, humility. We're putting God's kavod, or his doxa, on display. So it's a very different way to think about it. Last question. If you are a mirror designed to reflect the weight and honor of God to the world, what is currently smudging your reflection? But think about 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever, you do it all for not just the glory, the reputation of God. So switch those words in there. You guys, this was a challenging philosophical topic. You did great. I loved your questions and comments, and I will see you next week. Yes, next week is chapter 6, Sand Through the Hourglass.